She was the most educated woman in the house and the loneliest person in it. That is the contradiction at the center of the Victorian governess. And it is the contradiction that produced one of the most specific and most invisible forms of suffering the 19th century manufactured. She was too poor to be family and too educated to be a servant. She ate alone because the dining room would not have her and the servants' hall did not want her. She raised children who would grow up and forget her name. She taught subjects she had mastered at the cost of everything else in her life, and she was paid, when she was paid at all, a wage so low that saving for the future was impossible, and destitution in old age was not a risk but a certainty. The 1851 census recorded approximately 25,000 governesses in England and Wales. 25,000 women, occupying a position that the class system had created by accident and had no mechanism for accommodating. They existed in the gap between the family and the staff, belonging to neither world, needed by both, and valued by the system that employed them at a rate that would not have covered the cost of the family dog. Charlotte Brontë, who lived the position before she wrote about it, described the experience in words that have not softened with time. None but those who had been in the position of a governess, she wrote, could ever realize the dark side of respectable human nature. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a woman became a governess in Victorian England, what the position demanded of her body and her mind, what the household did to her pride and her health and her future, and why the most educated woman in the building was also the one the building was most carefully designed to make disappear. This is Dreadful History Files, and this is the story of the woman who stood between two worlds and belonged to neither. She did not choose this. That is where every governess story begins, and it is the part the novels almost always get right. A woman did not decide to become a governess the way a person decides to enter a profession. She became a governess because the alternative had collapsed. The typical path into the position was a path downward, a fall from the social class she had been born into, caused by a catastrophe that the Victorian economy produced with reliable frequency. A father who died leaving debts, a family business that failed, a clergyman whose living was withdrawn, a professional man whose investments did not survive the financial crises that rippled through the mid-19th century with the regularity of weather. The daughter of such a man, raised as a gentlewoman, educated in the accomplishments that gentlewomen were expected to possess, piano, drawing, French, needlework, literature, found herself in a situation that her entire upbringing had been designed to prevent and had not prepared her to manage. She could not work in a shop. That would be beneath her station and would sever her connection to the class she had been born into. She could not work in a factory. Same reason, with the additional consideration that factory work would destroy the physical presentation, the soft hands, the unmarked skin that constituted the visible evidence of her gentility. She could not marry her way out of the problem because the problem had eliminated her dowry, and without a dowry, the marriage market that her class operated through had very little use for her, regardless of her personal qualities. She could teach. That was the single respectable occupation available to an educated woman who needed to earn her own living without losing her social position. And teaching in a private household, as a governess, was the form of teaching that preserved the most of her remaining status, while requiring her to surrender the most of her remaining dignity. The Governesses' Benevolent Institution, founded in 1841, received applications from women who described themselves as standing on the brink of destitution and who hailed the establishment of the institution as a message from Providence to save them from despair. That language comes from the GBI's own internal reports, and it describes not the general condition of poverty, but the specific condition of educated women who had been raised to expect a certain kind of life and who found themselves, through no fault of their own, in a position where that life was no longer available, and the only life that was available required them to live inside a household that would remind them every day of exactly what they had lost. If you are watching Dreadful History Files for the first time, subscribe now, because the next part of this story is the part that the novels romanticized and the reality did not deserve. What happened to these women inside the houses that employed them has been waiting to be told without the costume drama softening the edges. The advertisement was the beginning. She placed it, or she answered it, in the pages of the Times or the Morning Post, or one of the domestic publications that carried columns of situations wanted and situations vacant in small print that functioned as a marketplace for women whose economic value the culture had determined was somewhere between a skilled cook and a junior clerk. The advertisement specified what she could offer, which was her education, her accomplishments, her character, and the desperate willingness that poverty produces in people who have been trained to conceal desperation behind composure. It specified what she required, which was a position, a salary, and the security of a roof over her head for as long as the arrangement lasted, which was typically the duration of the children's education, which was typically a few years, after which she would need to find another position and begin the process again. The interview was an assessment, and it was conducted by the mistress of the house with the evaluative precision of a woman who understood exactly what she was purchasing and exactly what she required it to do. The governess was assessed for her education, her manners, her appearance, her deportment, and her general suitability for prolonged proximity to the family. The assessment of her appearance carried a particular weight that the domestic management literature addressed with a directness that would be startling if it were not also so consistent across the sources. The mistress would often specify that the governess should be plain, not ugly, which would have reflected poorly on the household's taste, not attractive, which would have introduced a category of risk that the mistress was not prepared to manage. Plain, safely, neutrally, unthreateningly plain. The concern was not abstract. A governess who was too attractive was understood to represent a danger to the stability of the household, a potential distraction for the master or for older sons, a source of the domestic disruption that Mary Atkinson Maurice described in Governess Life in 1849, in terms that reveal the anxiety with undisguised alarm. Frightful instances have been discovered, Maurice wrote, in which she, to whom the care of the young has been entrusted, instead of guarding their minds in innocence and purity, has become the corrupter. The governess, in other words, was hired under suspicion. She was needed because the children required education. She was feared because her presence in the household introduced an educated woman into a domestic space that the Victorian social order had designed around the assumption that educated women existed within their own families, not within other people's. The governess violated that assumption by existing, and the household managed its anxiety about the violation by controlling every aspect of her behavior, her appearance, and her position within the domestic hierarchy with a thoroughness that the governess herself had no power to negotiate. The salary reflected the control. Charlotte Brontë earned £20 per year in her last position as a governess, and from that figure, washing expenses were deducted at source, reducing her actual income to £16. £16 per year for a woman who would later write one of the most celebrated novels in the English language. The GBI's records and the domestic advertisements of the period establish a range of between £15 and £100 per year for governesses, with the majority clustering at the lower end. A well-qualified governess in a wealthy household might earn £35 to £50. A less qualified governess in a less prosperous household might earn as little as 12 or 15. From these figures, she was expected to fund her own clothing, her own medical care, and her own travel between positions, which meant that the nominal salary and the disposable income were not the same figure, and the gap between them was the gap between subsistence and the kind of saving that might have provided some protection against the destitution that awaited her when the position ended. The position always ended. That is the structural fact that made the governess's situation genuinely precarious, rather than merely uncomfortable. Most employers needed a governess for a few years, the duration of their children's education before the boys were sent to school, and the girls were prepared for their debut. When the children outgrew the governess was dismissed, with a character reference if the employer was generous, and without one if the employer was not, and she returned to the marketplace to find another family and begin the process of integration, adaptation, and performance again from the beginning. The cycle repeated until the governess was too old to be employed, at which point the cycle stopped and nothing replaced it, because the system that had consumed her working life had made no provision for what happened after the working life was over. Now consider what her daily existence inside the household actually looked like, because the daily existence is where the loneliness was manufactured, and the loneliness was the product, not the accident, of a system that had placed her in a position it had no category for, and then managed the resulting awkwardness by making her invisible. She ate alone. This detail appears with such consistency across the governess literature, both fictional and documentary, that it constitutes a defining feature of the position, rather than a variable that differed between households. In some houses, the governess was invited to dine with the family, but the invitation was understood by both parties to be a concession rather than a right, and it could be withdrawn at any time for any reason. In many houses, the governess ate in the schoolroom, alone or with the children, eating food that had been sent up from the kitchen, which was not always the food the family was eating and was not always warm by the time it arrived. In some houses, the governess ate after the family had finished, receiving the remains of the meal that the family had not consumed, a practice that placed her nutritionally and symbolically below the family and that the household did not consider remarkable because the household had not been designed to consider her experience at all. The servants resented her. This detail also appears with a consistency that suggests a structural problem rather than an interpersonal one. The governess occupied a social position above the servants by birth and education, but she was employed in the household in a capacity that the servants understood as work, and the combination of superior social status and inferior economic status generated a friction that the household hierarchy could not resolve because the hierarchy had no category for it. The butler and the housekeeper, who occupied the top of the servant hierarchy, were paid more than most governesses. The cook, whose skill was valued more consistently than the governess's education, enjoyed a security of position that the governess did not. The housemaids, who were below the governess in social rank but who belonged unambiguously to the servants' world and therefore had a community within the household, possessed a form of social support that the governess's liminal position denied her. She was not invited to the servants' hall. She was not consistently included in the family's social life. She occupied a room in the house, typically near the nursery or schoolroom, that was neither in the family's quarters nor in the servants' quarters, but somewhere between them, architecturally and socially. A room that expressed her position with a spatial precision that the household probably did not intend and certainly did not examine. The children were the center of her working life and the most complex dimension of her emotional existence inside the household. She spent more time with the children than anyone else in the building, more than the mother, more than the father, more than the nurse or the nursery maid. She taught them. She supervised them. She accompanied them on walks and to church and to the social engagements that the family's schedule required. She knew their temperaments, their fears, their capabilities, their habits. She was, in every practical sense except the legal and biological one, the person who raised them. The children's response to this relationship varied. Some children tormented their governess with the specific cruelty that children are capable of when they understand that the person in front of them has no power to retaliate and no authority to punish beyond what the parents have delegated. Contemporary accounts describe children refusing to do their lessons, throwing the governess's work bag into the fire, forcing her to take them outside to play while her meal grew cold in the schoolroom, knowing that she could not compel their obedience without risking a complaint to the mother that might result in her dismissal. Older boys in some documented cases harassed their governess in ways that the household did not acknowledge, and the governess had no mechanism for reporting, because reporting it would require her to discuss a subject that her position within the household and her position within Victorian society equally prohibited her from raising. Most of what you have just heard about these women was documented in their own letters, their own diaries, and the records of the institution that was founded specifically because their suffering had become too visible to ignore. If you believe their experience deserves to be remembered with the honesty that the costume dramas denied them, drop a comment. Tell me what part of this you did not know was real. Dreadful History Files exists because you keep showing up for the stories that everyone else left out. Charlotte Bronte's experience as a governess produced a bitterness that survived her transformation into one of the most famous writers in England. In her final position, she earned £20 per year, minus deductions. She described the dark side of respectable human nature as something only a governess could fully understand, and when she was later invited, as a celebrated author, to tea at the home of William Makepeace Thackeray, She was so socially uncomfortable in the company of the literary establishment that she left the drawing room and sought out the family's governess, with whom she spent the remainder of the evening. The instinct tells you everything. A woman who had become famous enough to dine with the most celebrated novelist in England could not shake the identity that the position had burned into her. And the person in the house she felt safest with was the person who occupied the same gap she had once occupied herself. Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, published in 1847, drew directly on Anne's own experience as a governess and depicted the position with a plainness that the more dramatic Jane Eyre sometimes obscures. Agnes Grey shows the daily accumulation of small humiliations, the children who will not obey, the employer who will not intervene, the isolation that grows not from a single dramatic event, but from the steady repetition of days in which nobody in the building acknowledges you as a complete person. The novel is quieter than Jane Eyre. It is also, in many respects, more honest about what the position actually felt like from inside. The GBI's records document the trajectory. A woman entered the profession in her 20s, driven there by financial necessity. She worked for 15 or 20 years, moving between positions, never accumulating savings sufficient to provide for her future, never establishing the kind of permanent household that might have given her stability, never marrying because marriage required leaving the position and the position was the only income she had. She reached her 40s. The children she had taught were grown. The families she had served had moved on. The marketplace had younger women available, women whose accomplishments were more current and whose physical stamina had not yet been depleted by 2 decades of work performed under conditions that the employer's household had not been designed to sustain. She was, by this point, what the Victorian system called redundant. The word was used in the same period to describe the surplus women identified by the 1851 census, the women for whom there were mathematically no husbands available, and its application to the governess who had aged out of the only profession open to her carried the same implication. She was no longer useful. The system that had consumed her youth and her education and her health had no provision for what came after, and what came after, for a governess without savings and without family support, was poverty. The governess's benevolent institution attempted to address this poverty, but its resources were overwhelmed from the beginning. By the end of 1847, the GBI had secured 4 annuities of £15 each for retired governesses. There were 90 applicants. The arithmetic of compassion was as merciless as the arithmetic of the marketplace. The GBI established the Asylum for Aged Governesses, a retirement home for women who had spent their working lives in other people's houses and who now required a house of their own because the profession that had taken everything from them had given nothing back. The asylum was a genuine act of charity. It was also a monument to the failure of the system it was designed to remedy, because a system that required a charitable institution to prevent its most educated female workers from dying in poverty was not a system that had failed accidentally. It was a system that had never included their survival in its calculations. Queen's College, London, was founded in 1848, partly through the efforts of the GBI, to provide a formal education for governesses and raise the standard of the profession. The college offered courses in English, mathematics, history, geography, languages, music, and drawing, taught by professors from King's College, London. It was the first institution in England to award academic qualifications to women. The irony that the most substantial educational advance for women in the 19th century was driven by the need to improve the training of women who were employed to educate the children of families that would not have permitted those same women to sit at their dinner table is a specifically Victorian form of irony, and it operates with the same quiet precision that the era applied to everything it built. She wore gray. By the 1880s, the governess's dress had been formalized into a uniform that communicated her position with the same visual precision that the servant's livery communicated theirs. A long plain skirt, gray or black, a high-collared blouse, hair scraped back into a tight bun and secured under a net. No jewelry, no color, no visible expression of personal taste or individual identity. The uniform said what the household required it to say, which was that this woman was present in the building in a professional capacity, that her presence was functional rather than decorative, and that the function she performed did not entitle her to the visual markers of belonging that the family wore, or the communal identity that the servant's livery provided. She wore gray, because gray was the color of the gap she lived in, not the white of the family, and not the black of the servants, but something between them, visible and invisible simultaneously. The woman who entered this profession did not enter it because she lacked intelligence or ambition, or the capacity for a different kind of life. She entered it because the system that had produced her, the system that had educated her and trained her and raised her to expect a specific kind of future, had failed to deliver that future and had provided no alternative except one, and the one alternative it had provided required her to spend the best years of her life inside other people's houses, raising other people's children, eating other people's leftover food in a room designed to remind her every day that she was needed enough to be employed and not valued enough to be included. She deserved better than the gap. She deserved a salary that reflected her education. She deserved a position in the household that acknowledged her as a person rather than a function. She deserved a future that did not end in the charity ward of an institution founded because the profession that had consumed her life had made no provision for its end. She deserved to eat her meals at a table with other human beings who considered her company worth having. She did not get any of those things, because the system that employed her had been designed around a different set of priorities, and her well-being was not among them. The system needed educated women to teach the children of the wealthy. The system did not need those women to be happy, or healthy, or adequately compensated, or included in the life of the household, or provided for in old age. The system needed them to be available, and affordable, and quiet, and grateful, and willing to accept the terms as offered because the alternative to accepting them was the workhouse, and the workhouse was worse, and the system knew it was worse, and the system set its wages accordingly. Charlotte Bronte wrote her way out. Anne Bronte wrote her way out. The other 25,000 did not. They served and they endured, and they ate alone in the schoolroom, and they wore gray, and they taught other people's children to read and write and draw and play the piano. And then the children grew up, and the position ended, and the next position began, and the one after that, until there were no more positions, and no more children, and no more schoolrooms. And the woman who had spent her life between two worlds discovered that neither world had saved a place for her on the other side. The asylum for aged governesses took some of them. The workhouse took others. The record lost the rest, the way it always lost women whose value the system had exhausted and whose presence the system no longer required. They vanished into the census columns, a name and an age and the word governess in fading ink, and the house they had served continued without them, and the children they had raised remembered them or did not, and the gap they had occupied closed behind them as though it had never contained a person at all. They deserved to be remembered as more than a literary archetype. Jane Eyre is magnificent. Agnes Grey is honest. Neither of them is a substitute for the 25,000 real women who lived the position without the escape hatch of a best-selling novel, who carried the isolation and the underpayment and the gray dress and the cold schoolroom meal through decades of service that the system valued at £16 a year, minus washing. They were the most educated women in the building. They were also the loneliest, and the distance between those two facts is the distance the Victorian class system maintained between what it needed from women and what it was willing to give them in return. Subscribe to Dreadful History Files. The past was not what they told you it was, and the next story is already waiting in a room you were never invited to enter.